A warm hello and welcome to you all. The name of the paper I'm about to present is In the Alleys of the Lost Self, a Decolonial Search for Image, and I am Sanskriti Chattopadhyay. Without further ado, allow me to begin by a story. This is the story of Antarjali Jatra by Kamal Kumar Mojumdar, around which this paper is woven. Old Sitaram is brought to the banks of holy river Ganga, where he would draw his last breath. Awaiting his death, the astrologer predicts that he would take a partner with him to heaven. Following this oracle, Jashaboti, a young woman on the verge of adulthood, is given in marriage to the old man, with the implicit expectation that with his death she will become Sati. In other words, sacrifice herself on the burning pyre. Whoever goes through this process becomes a divine being in their mortal lives. After the marriage, as people leave, in this huge bank of Ganga remains three humans: Sitaram, Jashaboti, and a man of lower birth, Boiju, who would help in burning them. Boiju tries to help Jashaboti to run away, but here, in the solitary banks, Jashaboti goes through a change. She begins to feel this transformation into the divine. Finally, by a stroke of chance, Sitaram drowns by a sudden tidal wave. And trying to save his life, Jashaboti gets stuck in an abandoned icon of a Hindu goddess and dies. Keeping this narrative at the center, more precisely this novel at the center, we are developing three columns to work around. These three columns are subaltern, the idea of the subaltern, decoloniality, and image consciousness. Maybe it would be a little useful for us if we delve a bit deeper into these terms. If we begin with subaltern at first, the origin of the word subaltern is quite dramatic. From just a military title in the hands of Antonio Gramsci, it became a secret synonym for the word proletariat to save his writing from censorship while he was in prison, which has in the absence of any so-called definition of this term, which has arisen in the face of situational pressure, it has acquired a strange derivation through which many social identities and struggles can express themselves, especially those which do not fall under any particular class analysis. In the hands of post-colonial experts, the term not only gained a definition but also a kind of wisdom. It became a term to represent the special identity of people from many remote corners of a multifaceted society. At its core, decoloniality connects progress of modernity with the violence of coloniality. Like the two sides of the same coin, this violence is not only the violence of the physical, but it's also a violence in the realm of the psychological. Ngugi wa Thiong'o's 1986 masterpiece, Decolonizing the Mind, argues that colonialism did more than impose control over people's lands and resources through military conquest and political dictatorship, but also dominated the mental universe of the colonized and has continued to do so long after independence was gained. This control over time has woven a veil of silence that filtered and diffused the other voices. This becomes an important area of concern for many and important authors of decoloniality today. Speaking of image consciousness, it is important to say that image here is not just about audiovisual images. Rather, it is an idea of an inherent instinct that exists in the human spatial memory. Eminent philosopher Gilles Deleuze said that an image is equal to flowing matter. And since everything is flowing matter, an image is nothing but a universe, a cosmic fragment, a universe fragment. The image discussed here is not a product, Neither is it a produce. It doesn't require an expression, but it exists as an innate human quality. In this study of images, the primary resource would be Kamal Kumar Mojumdar's narrative language that is emerging from the craft sensibilities. We have heard an excerpt from one of his novels, closely observing various artifacts, making the subtle differences between the artifacts and practicing the craft of woodcut and sketch. Kamal Kumar entangled himself with an incisive inquiry of the representational space as a whole. His essays show evidence of his consciousness of the converging and centralizing effect of the European Renaissance perspective. The craft world in today's technocratic environment has been dwarfed by ample callousness and amnesia. The artifactual expressions of life through craft has been sidelined. But in the pre-industrial times, as presented by Pamela Smith in her book, The Body of the Artisan, Art and Experience in Scientific Revolution, if scholars conceived of problems in that time, or indeed of reality, primarily in terms of words and the manipulation of words, artisans might see reality as intimately related to the material objects. Thus, art and craft was about understanding a material language. A lettered man, a scholar, was committing to his or her memories and could call to mind a corpus of knowledge contained in text, whereas artisans often formulated their knowledge and processes of cognition not in words but instead in works. Craft is not just part of life, it is a mode of special relationship to time, space, and nature. After the European Renaissance, there was a definite turn towards the visual. Initially a liberating tool, it spatially gave rise to cartography, conceptually gave rise to teleology, temporally gave rise to our notion of history. And in the process, the utopia of emancipation at the end of the vanishing point on the horizon line. But as the influence grew, we got habituated gradually to see everything. Seeing became a way of knowledge creation. Proof and validity was prioritized above other senses. It was kind of a philosophical issue, and it was noted by Heidegger. Within the domain of the visuals, rationality, disembodiedness, framed objectification, realism, mimesis, context-free value, a whole load of modernist assertions got transplanted. Gradually, there became a steady denial of tactile vision of the craft world. The fetish for the visual can be linked to the discovery of the single point perspective in painting in Italy, known as the Renaissance perspective. Creating the optical illusion of depth by precise geometrical means somehow brought back the Platonic ideas about art practice. Plato was known for his criticism of the musicians as lower mortals, who strain both the musical instruments and the ears of the audience to tune the instruments, but do not use pure mathematical means to get the exact tones. Plato was undermining the deep cognitive method of arriving at the tune in favor of an objective algorithm. Renaissance perspective became the algorithm for the mimesis of reality. The shift from the traditional novel form, where the narrative space is another extension of the European Renaissance perspective, was gradual in the case of Kamal Kumar, as visible in his trajectory from his first novel Antarjali Jatra, the narrative of which we heard a little while back, to Suhasini's Pomatum, one of his more mature works. In Antarjali Jatra, the language has already gone through a substantial shift, where it's neither written in a colloquial Bengali nor in a formal Bengali. Legibility as the primary mean of causation of the linear logic of the European Renaissance perspective is challenged when the relationship between the signifier and signified is changed by challenging the syntax through the help of altering and pushing the limits of governance in sentence. It's not unintelligible, the sentence anymore, but the assumption of cognition is questioned. When we read a sentence, we assume the meaning of the sentence as our brains receive the word, even before our eyes have cognized it. Since that flow is challenged, each of the word is now being focused on. The reading is not anymore a process of uninterrupted cognition, rather a paused, concentrated, reflective progression. The narrative and the structure of the narrative are both parts of the experience of reading. Despite this, the novel still holds some other elements of the novel tradition that is visible strongly within the text. Character arcs, setting, movement of plot, conflict, climax, resolution, these are all present in strong manner. By the time we reach Suhasini's Pomatum, not only he is subverting each of these elements, but also challenging the construction of placing a sentence after another in causal succession. He is doing this but by writing a 72-page long novel in one unfinished sentence. Although this novel is not within the direct purview of our case studies, it is introduced here as an introduction to the arc of the author himself. Kamal Kumar did employ various tools of syntactic rupture, though they may look primarily as formal devices. It can be argued that the formal endeavor was related to sacrificing the horizontal flow of the sentence for the sake of piled up structure and its amorphous verticality, significant alteration of the cognition of the narrative space in terms of narrative appropriation and the moral economy of the narrative, the idea of emergence between writer and the writing, linguistic narrative expression, at times seen as a representational act of the artisanal craft, writing as an assemblage of broken syntactic pieces to make language like visceral layers of archaeology replete with broken and incongruous craft pieces from another era and other imagined sensibilities. What Kamal Kumar could achieve is phenomenal. His whole project can be seen as a linguistic critique to the European Renaissance perspective, done with the sensibility of a visual craftsman, relating to a lost visual sensibility. Where frames are absent, light does not produce shadow, and three-dimensional illusionary mimesis has not replaced the multi-perspectival two-dimensional visual aesthetics. He actually could offer a workable alternative against the hegemonic generalization of European Renaissance perspective influenced artistic sensibility. With the premise clarified, it now becomes a question: why are we applying a contemporary premise triad, that of subaltern decoloniality and image consciousness, to a narrative that describes a concept and system of the past, the concept of becoming sati? Is there a secret anthropological desire behind it? If I may borrow Dipesh Chakraborty's concept of provincializing Europe, the practice of sati, the existence of a woman between the mortal and the divine, faces us as a way of being in this world. Can that way of being be a possibility for our own lives and what we define as the present? We are not anthropologizing the figure of sati here, as the otherness of this figure is not what the present possibility is dependent on. This gesture achieves something interesting. History, written from any background, whether that of the otherized or the dominant, always has a subject-object relationship. The historian's gaze toward the study object and the agency hidden within it is dissolved in this gesture of making the icon of sati a possibility of the present. Wilhelm von Humboldt put the point well in his 1821 address on the task of the historian delivered to the Berlin Academy of Sciences. Where two beings are separated by a total gap, no bridge of understanding extends from one to another. In order to understand one another, they must have, in another sense, already understood each other. We are not the same as the woman who is standing in front of burning pyre to be Sati. And also the enigma of the existence of the divine within the mortal is not and cannot be understood in the few words here. From the lens of social justice, the idea of burning a living woman of pyre on the pyre would not even be a consideration. Yet, indeed, the only way we can even begin to imagine and create the imagination of sati within us is by a proposed contemporaneity. According to Chakraborty, the writing of history must implicitly assume a plurality of times existing together. Maybe the plurality of times is also useful in our imagination of images emerging from multiple perspectives. Making visible this disjuncture is what the subaltern pasts allow us to do. If we draw a parallel from a European context, the medieval in Europe is often strongly associated with the supernatural and the magical. But what makes the historicizing of it possible is the fact that its basic characteristics are not completely foreign to us as moderns, which is not to deny the historical changes that separate the two. In the writings of Aaron Gurevich, for example, the modern makes its pact with the medieval through the use of anthropology, that is, in the use of contemporary anthropological evidence from outside of Europe to make sense of the past of Europe. Jacques Le Goff quotes, I'm quoting from Jacques Le Goff, that people today, even who consult seers and fortune tellers, call spirits to the floating table, or participate in black masses, recognize a frontier between the visible and the invisible, the natural and the supernatural. This was not true of medieval man. Not only was the visible for him merely the trace of the invisible, the supernatural overflowed into daily life at every turn. Thus, the practice of sati, as explored by Kamal Kumar in his incredible craft-influenced narrative style, does more than just show us a possible moment of the past in its beauty. By bridging the past with the present and bringing these two temporalities around our modern minds, a border is evoked, a border where the medieval may exist. Subaltern past are signposts of this border. The reason for this is that subaltern past do not give us give us any principle of narration that can rationally be defended in our modern public life. In this desecration of rationality, a possibility emerges where the image consciousness of the other may come to the fore. To borrow from Robin Horton's illuminating studies of African thought, gods and spirits are not dependent on human beliefs for their own existence. What brings them to presence are our practices. And similarly, the images emerging out of these consciousnesses do not require us for their existence. We can only make their presence felt. Thus, what allows historians to historicize the medieval or the ancient and us to look back and find a lost image is the very fact that these worlds are never completely lost. We inhabit their fragments even when we classify ourselves as modern and secular. These pasts enable history while marking the limits of history visible. Gadamer, in his explanation of Heidegger's philosophy, stated, "The experience of history, which we ourselves have, is covered only to a small degree by that which we would name historical consciousness." Subaltern pasts remind us that a relation of contemporaneity between the non-modern and the modern, a shared and constant now, from where a parallel idea of image begins to unfurl. Now, as an end note, an ode to the location where we stand, the city of Zaragoza itself, because it has a very intriguing connection with the parallel image making possibility. I am referring to the manuscript found in Zaragoza by Jan Potocki and the subsequent 1965 film by Wojciech Haas named the Zaragoza manuscript. To take the novel into consideration, it is as eccentric as its author, a Polish who studied in Switzerland, a self taught ethnographer traveling through Asia and Europe. He was also one of the first to ride a hot air balloon in 1790. Believed to be a Freemason, Potocki killed himself with a silver bullet, thinking that he was turning into a werewolf. This is already a man whose consciousness seems to challenge our safe rational spaces. There is a series of complexities in the writing, partly emerging from the fact that it is written by a Polish man in the language French, based on Spanish stylistic, cultural, and locational space. The narrative assumes the time of Napoleonic Wars and the sack of Zaragoza in 1809, making it a piece connecting to the contemporary. It was finished in 1815, and as well as of the past. This romantic Gothic piece is a frame narrative or a story within story structure, as retained in the cinematic transition as well. The content of the narrative becomes the context of writing the narrative, as the character who finds the book and asks it to be translated becomes a part of the convoluted structure as well. Characters like brigands, gypsies, Kabbalists, Moorish princesses, and Islamic travelers not only add to the cultural exoticism but also to the Baroque nature of the imagery. It truly is a privilege to be able to present on the idea of image consciousness in a space that has been immortalized in literature and cinema for the practice of parallel image consciousness. And I truly thank you all for that.